Hello everyone and welcome to today's session on 10Pulse. Today we'll be covering a little bit of detail into understanding the 10Pulse tool within Weekly10. So myself, Andy Roberts, founder and CEO at Weekly10, and Chris Shenton, who's our head of people science, will be taking us through some of the detail and science behind the tool. So what is 10Pulse? Well, 10Pulse is an AI-based metric or analytic within Weekly10. It allows you to understand passively, so without asking direct questions of your employees, levels of engagement within the organization. And it combines a number of different metrics, including sentiment from check-ins and also platform interaction. And that platform interaction is focused around how employees and managers are using the tool itself. So using the whole Weekly10 platform. So what we'll do today is we'll talk about the different aspects of 10Pulse, the different components as we call them, and we'll also take you through a bit of a practical view on how to use 10Pulse and also how to improve your 10Pulse scores if you find they're lacking or they're below the recommended levels. So hopefully a very practical session for you to take away and actually implement within your organizations. And to go into a bit of detail on the components of 10Pulse and what they really mean, I'll just hand over to Chris Shenton, who's of course our head of people science, and he will take you through those components.
Thank you very much, Andy, and morning, afternoon, evening to everyone who's joined us today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. So as Andy says, I'm just going to take you through some of an overview on what the 5 components are. So these 5 components come from research by Ipsos, the big organizational research company based out over in the States. I'm sure you've all heard of them. They did this research 2015, 2016, and they started from a point of view of looking at engagement and saying, well, you know what, there's loads of definitions out there. There aren't very many models. We need to try and consolidate a little bit and come up with some really practical, useful frameworks when it comes to employee engagement. And these are the 5 components they came up with. So 10Pulse uses the exact same components, and the first 2 are external measures. These are things that we can see within our people, and they are discretionary effort and employee advocacy. Now I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these in a minute, but it's just to understand that, you know, these are things that we can see our people doing at any one time, and it's relatively easy to measure once you understand the signs and can spot them. Less easy to measure, perhaps, are the internal elements and components. So we have here pride, and in terms of pride, we typically talk about company pride, so pride in the business we work for, job satisfaction, and feeling valued. And as I say, these are more internal measures and slightly trickier to measure accurately unless you're utilizing things like sentiment analysis and 10Pulse. So we'll get into more details on that in a while. How this looks in the platform now, Andy is going to take you through a demo in a little bit, so you will see it. But what we have here are a few screenshots showing 10Pulse as it appears on Weekly10. On the left-hand side, we have the overall 10Pulse engagement score. So we can see that this company are engaged at a level of 7.6, and it ranges from 1 to 10. But then we can see the middle and on the right, separate scores for discretionary effort and job satisfaction. So it's a really useful tool to understand not only how are you doing from an engagement point of view, but on each of these components, you know, where are your strengths, where are your weaknesses, and you can compare between departments, teams, locations, any sort of grouping that you want to set within Weekly10. Now, let's look at these in a little bit more detail. I am from a scientific background, so I love a definition. So I will define each of these, even though some of them seem really obvious, but it's always good to make sure everyone's on a level playing field when it comes to understanding. And we'll go over a few interesting bits and bobs about why they're important. So discretionary effort, that's defined by Ipsos as a level of effort an employee is capable of giving, but one that exceeds bare minimum. Essentially, it's going the extra mile. And now discretionary effort of all the 5 components has the biggest impact when it comes to engagement impacting productivity and quality of service, quality of product. It stands to reason. If people give a little bit more, we get a little bit more out of them, and outputs change because of that. Now, what's really interesting is when you speak to people who are engaged, we see that actually they're more than willing to go the extra mile. 82% according to one piece of research, 82% of engaged employees say they're happy to go that extra mile and give us a little bit more than the bare minimum. And that's actually backed up by managers. So 98% of managers say that, you know what, of the people who are most engaged within this business, they're the guys that give us the most effort, the most attention. So it's really nice to see that those sort of two statistics back each other up. It's not just employees saying they'll go the extra mile, it's managers saying we see it all the time with our engaged teams. Then advocacy. So when we talk about advocacy, we talk about employee advocacy, and we talk specifically around the promotion and awareness of a company and or its products, services by the employees who work there. Now, when you hear the word advocacy, yeah, promotion makes sense. Awareness perhaps is a bit more of a surprising word to use when it comes to advocacy, but if people aren't aware of what it is your business are doing at any one time, they can't be good advocates. So we approach it from a point of view of both. It's about how well they talk about your business, both internally and externally, and actually because of that, how aware they are of what it is you do as a business. Now, research shows that 86% of engaged employees say that they're really happy to talk positively about their place of work, and that's a huge benefit. There are a number of reasons why we want people talking positively about the places they work, not just simply to reinforce engagement, but to help us attract new business. If people talk positively about us, more people are going to hear about us in a positive light. Makes sense. Improve retention and hiring processes. Again, if people are going to tell people we're a great place to work, we're more likely to attract top talent. It creates a positive workplace culture, which is almost self-reinforcing from an employee engagement point of view. Increased brand visibility, so people just hear about us more frequently. And humanizing your business, which is a really big benefit, which quite often gets overlooked. But you know, businesses aren't these monolithic brands and logos. They are people-centric places. They're built up of people. So especially as you get bigger as a business, it can be tricky to hold on to that humanizing element. But brand advocacy, employee advocacy really helps us there. Pride, as I said before, it's really about company pride and pride in what it is your business is doing. So company pride is a workplace atmosphere where employees feel a sense of happiness, commitment, and motivation for what it is they're doing. And really interestingly, Robert Half, who are a big US-based talent and recruitment business with about 40,000 or so employees, they looked at this a couple of years ago and found that actually pride in what a company is doing is the #1 motivational factor when it comes to employee engagement. It's a huge reason why people actually are engaged in the workplace. If you don't agree with the business principles of where you work, if you do not agree with the direction your business is going in, it can be very, very tricky to be engaged. And interestingly, 90% of engaged employees rate the pride that they have in their company as high or very high. So again, that engagement measure is really clear, that correlation between engagement and how proud people are. But worryingly, perhaps only 41% of employees globally believe they really understand the aims and objectives of their company. So that's a little red flag to say, how can people be proud in what they're doing and what their business is doing if they're not really clear on that? And in a little while, when we talk about interventions, Andy will point out a couple of ways in which you can help align and make objectives clearer. Job satisfaction, it's a really simple one, probably doesn't need a definition, but always good to cover it anyway. The level of contentment employees feel with their job, including targets, output, ways of working, colleagues and managers. This is more of an internal sort of feeling, whereas company pride is more about the external. This is more about how you feel with the job that you're doing. Again, unsurprisingly, people who are satisfied in their jobs stay in them longer, up to 7 times longer, in fact. And those who aren't satisfied in their jobs cost us money. On average, in the UK, a dissatisfied employee will cost a business somewhere in the region of £2,732 during their tenure with our business. So it really pays to make sure people are satisfied. And then finally, feeling valued. Everybody wants to feel valued at work, and the Ipsos definition of that is feeling like others, particularly management, care that you are part of the business and that your work counts. Now, again, unsurprisingly, it's a really big impact when it comes to engagement. And actually, last year, despite all the talk about great resignation and people moving on for reasons due to wanting more flexibility at work, last year, according to Indeed, people left their employers more frequently than any other reason. The #1 reason was they didn't feel valued. Now, that flexibility question might play into that, but certainly the reason people give is, I do not feel valued at the workplace, so that is why I'm leaving. And then just to sort of hammer home the importance of how people feeling valued is really important to an engagement point of view, 70% of variance in employee engagement is linked to the manager and their relationship with their people. Very specifically, that relationship hinges on how managers make people feel valued, how they bring them in from a developmental point of view, and how they communicate. And so feeling valued is a large part of that. And there are 5 components which we measure 10Pulse on. So what I'll do now is I'll hand back over to Andy, who's going to sort of show you 10Pulse in a little bit more detail and talk through some of the uses for it.
in terms of why would you use 10Pulse and how you use it, there's 5 key things here that I'll briefly talk about. The first thing, really quite obvious, I guess from what we talked about so far, but 10Pulse is really useful to understand engagement across your whole company or individual teams. And the Weekly 10 platform, as we'll show in a second, allows you to group by different groups within your organization to understand those different trends and how they're impacting different parts of the organization. It allows you to see those teams that are highly engaged and also discover opportunities to increase engagement in certain areas. And this is a really key aspect to the platform. It also will help you unearth pinch points and intervention strategies. So as we'll talk about in a moment, there are a number of things that you can do to help increase engagement. And if you use those areas of guidance, as well as seeing a 10Pulse score increase, those activities will have a direct impact on the engagement levels of the organization. Number 4 is quite key. We wouldn't necessarily say 10Pulse is a complete replacement for engagement surveys or even pulsing, but what 10Pulse gives you is it essentially gives you a real-time view of engagement in your organization. And what it allows you to do is replace some of the long-winded approaches to engagement surveys such as a Q12 or ad hoc or pulse surveys that are done during the year, and replace that with more targeted intervention and questioning. So one of the typical use cases that we see with 10Pulse is that you monitor the levels of engagement in the organization, and where there are below average levels of engagement in certain areas of the organization, you are able then to follow that up with additional questioning, potentially more intense pulsing of those parts of the organization to understand the key issues there. One of the worst things you can do is continually ask questions of your people with very little feedback back to them. And we know that often some of the things that will come out of engagement surveys are affecting a subset of the organization rather than absolutely everybody in the organization. So sometimes those interventions are better in a targeted way rather than a one-size-fits-all way. And then finally, and this is a really big area of development for us from a product perspective at Weekly 10, is that using the data from 10Pulse, you can look at implied attrition risk within your organization. So early next year, we will be releasing a predictive analytic, which is based on 10Pulse. So if you have 10Pulse in place and you're using 10Pulse at the moment, this will simply slot on top of that tool. And what Weekly 10 predictive analytics will allow you to do is actually highlight the areas of the organization where there is a higher than average risk of attrition, so of turnover of staff. And that will be a really powerful way of actually planning ahead and understanding the impacts that these engagement metrics have on the organization and on the people in your organization. So now we've talked about that, we'll jump in and take a quick look at the tool itself. So if you're not familiar with 10Pulse, this will just give you a quick guide as to how to access the system, how to access the tool, and in doing so, you will be able to get started and understand how the tool works. So 10Pulse is available at the moment only through your web platform. So of course, if you're using Teams or you're using one of our app integrations, managers and employees can use those platforms. But as an administrator, either a super admin, HR admin, or a departmental admin, if you go to the dashboard, so your organizational dashboard within the web version, you've got access to your sentiment and your check-in rates and various other factors around the questioning that you have. And on the right-hand side, you will see your 10Pulse engagement score widget, and that covers all of the 5 areas that Chris has talked about. By default, it will show the overall score, and the overall score is a weighted average of the 5, an evenly weighted average of the 5 components. And if you hover over each one, it will show you the individual score itself. Now, The RAG status, so the red, amber, green status, is showing you whether something is significantly below average, just below average, which would be amber, and then above average, which is green. We do have metrics around this. So within our help pages, we've got recommended guidance around the different thresholds and what they mean. But if you jump in and click on View Details, that will now load up the 10Pulse Analytics screen. And within this, first of all, you will see your overall view. So you'll see your overall 10Pulse score. So nothing crazy happening here in terms of trends. We can see quite clearly the overall trend is relatively flat. You have the ability to change the periodic measurements. So if I change this to quarter, it gives me a little bit more of a view. So I can see quite clearly that between Q4 and Q1, there was a slight drop in engagement. And then actually we've seen 2 consecutive increases, relatively minor increases, but increases all the same in that engagement score over that period of time. By default, you will see this current year, but you can, of course, go in and go to one of our quick filters or go further back by selecting the metrics here. So if I go back right the way back to September 2020, I can now see an overall view quarter by quarter over that full year, over that full period. Below, you will see the overall summary. So you'll see by date, the average 10Pulse score, in this case by quarter, but of course, if I was looking at this by month, I will see the monthly values. And what you can also do is group. So what we can see first of all is just the overall score in the organization, but we can go in and do our filtering, as you can with many of the aspects of the Weekly 10 analytics. You can either filter by team or department, or if you do have person properties set for your organization, any of those groupable person properties will be available under the filters. But you can also do the grouping directly. So let's say, for example, I want to look at the engagement trends between each of the departments in our organization. I can clearly see here the marketing trend versus the customer success team trend. And of course, I can just select that quite nicely here, just by unselecting the values. And I can here see that we've got quite high levels of engagement within marketing and customer success. However, what's very clear here is that customer success has seen a big jump in engagement over 2 quarters in this period here, and is currently baselining much higher actually than the marketing score itself. So this gives you a bit of flexibility over what you see within your charts. Of course, when you do the grouping, Weekly 10 will also summarize that grouping in the table below. So now I'm seeing the 10Pulse averages by quarter and by each individual department. I can export this data simply by right-clicking, export to CSV or to Excel if you want to take that out into an Excel format. The other thing to note here is that you cannot look at individual 10Pulse scores. So we group at 5 employees or more. So what that means is, as you'll see if I click on department, you'll actually see there's an empty option here, and that basically is collecting all of the people who are in a department which is less than 5 people. So you just need to bear that in mind. If you're looking by team, for example, if you've got teams of less than 5 people, those teams will be bucketed into this empty bucket, and then every department or every team, for example, with more than 5 or more employees, you'll be able to see the overall view. So it is an anonymized metric within the platform itself. As well as grouping by one of those person groups, what you can also do is group by score components. So these are all the components that Chris was talking about. So by doing so, I'm now splitting that overall engagement trend, which looked relatively flat, if you remember, into those 5 individual components. And you can very clearly see here that Pride took a significant dip over 3 or 4 quarters, and then actually has slowly recovered to an extent over the following period, and actually is one of the highest metrics that we have within the platform. Feeling valued, advocacy, job satisfaction, and discretionary effort, we can see all of those mapped out within the view here. So this gives you a really good view over trends using the time series chart here. The other really good way of looking at 10Pulse is using our heat map. So if you simply click on the button here, it will take you from the chart view to the heat map view. And now, if I just look, let's say, for example, for the last year, I can now see a heat map of the organization, and by default we're grouped by department, but we could change this to team if we wanted to. And now what it's showing us is the hot and cold areas of engagement across the organization. So immediately for the last year, I can see sales and people science have a very consistent engagement level. I can see that management have a bit of a kind of a lumpy engagement view, and then marketing one of the strongest, together with customer success, in terms of those engagement levels. But clearly we can see high levels of advocacy in customer success and within marketing as well. So you see those hot and cold areas of the organization. So, you know, a few things that stick out here, looking at some of our data on the right hand side, we can see that R&D have quite low levels of pride compared to the rest of the organization. So that might be something that you'd want to jump in and have a further look at within the system itself. So hopefully that gives you an overview of how you can access the tool, how you can access the data within the system. And what we'll now do is we'll jump back and we'll have a quick look at what you can do in terms of what impacts those individual components within 10Pulse. Great. So what influences 10Pulse within the system? So first of all, discretionary effort. Discretionary effort is heavily influenced by achievement and demonstrating the ability to go the extra mile. So this is typically taken from what people achieve in terms of their goal setting within the system. So if you're using goal setting, this will really help the system to understand levels of discretionary effort, whether people are setting those stretch goals, how they're achieving those over time, and also within some of the qualitative data within the system. So looking at the achievement question within Weekly10, for example. So if you have a question which reflects on achievements, the system also looks at the trends around how people are talking about their achievements over time. When it comes to advocacy, recognizing others is a key driver to this. So are people recognizing and sharing other people's success, and how are they talking about the company as a whole? So not just about their own achievements, but how are they talking more positively about the organization? And our algorithm picks up on these indicators within some of those open responses within the check-ins themselves. Pride is predominantly driven by sentiment of check-ins, and also the way in which people, again, are sharing their achievements and the company achievements themselves. Job satisfaction tends to look more at changes in sentiment over time, and how content they are. So certain aspects of sentiment which shows contentness, as opposed to chopping and changing or what have you. So job satisfaction tends to look at trends over a certain time to see how positive people are feeling about their roles. And then finally, feeling valued is really driven by manager engagement and peer engagement with an individual. So if somebody is being recognized both through a mention, so a recognition through the system, but also receiving feedback from their manager, they're much more likely to feel valued within reality, but also within the model as well. So feeling valued is actually heavily driven by recognition and the number of different elements of recognition available within Weekly10. So how do you improve your scores? So we've talked about the influence there. So what are the individual influences that we see within within 10Pulse itself? Well, how do you improve your scores? So if you do see a low score, this grid is a really useful way of looking at Weekly10 capability and functionality and how that maps back to some of these components. Now, it's not one action for one component. A number of different aspects of the utilization of the Weekly10 platform influences these different elements. So some of the key ones here which drive a number of the factors I'll just mention, and you will get a copy of this deck over later following up from this webinar, but manager feedback is one of the key drivers. Both discretionary effort, advocacy, job satisfaction, and significantly feeling valued are influenced by manager interaction. So are managers reviewing check-ins, firstly, and secondly, are they providing feedback, and what type of feedback are they providing? Are they providing constructive feedback within the system itself? So if you're looking to improve one of those scores, it's really critical that you ensure that you have high levels of manager review rate within the system. Being recognized and recognizing others. So if you can encourage people to use the recognition functionality within Weekly10, you will see big impacts in pride and feeling valued specifically. These have both an outgoing and an inbound impact. So if people are willing to recognize others, that shows strong levels of advocacy, and it also shows that people are quite satisfied with their overall environment as well. When you're receiving feedback, that really helps people improve their levels of pride, the way in which they feel satisfied in their job, and also feeling valued as well. So what I would say is manager feedback and recognition are two of the really significant areas that have a big impact. Lastly, I will just mention around sharing successes. So sharing successes is essentially where people are logging their achievements in the system, typically via an open check-in question around achievements. That's really important, feeds into a lot of kind of reflective behavior towards the end of the year if you're doing performance reviews or conversations, but it also demonstrates that people are reflecting on those achievements and sharing successes, and that is a key driver to a number of the components within here as well. If you're using goals, encouraging people to use those goals will have a big impact on what they're doing, and in terms of discretionary effort, goal setting is a real key driver. Finally, on the right hand side, frequent one-to-ones, as well as the check-ins. Having frequent one-to-ones as a whole, even though we don't use one-to-one data within the model specifically, it tends to be more towards the check-in data. Frequent one-to-ones will have a knock-on impact on those check-ins, and will have a knock-on impact on these 5 individual areas in the way in which people are using the platform. We will provide this in a bit more data over to you following the webinar, so it will give you a really good idea as to if you are seeing an area of one of the components lower than you might hope. You can use this grid to actually see what you're doing at the moment and some of those areas that you may want to increase participation in or focus on a little bit more detail. And with that, I'll hand back to Chris, and we will now jump on and see if anyone has any questions for us.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Thank you very much for that, running through everything for everyone. We have got a few questions, so we are pretty much bang on time, guys, so if anyone needs to drop off, feel free, but I will run through a couple of questions that have come in. Question number 1, I think I remember during onboarding being told I needed to ask certain types of questions for 10Pulse to work. Is that correct? Do you want to stay on?
Yeah, I'll pick that one, Chris. Yes, so basically to have an effective 10Pulse score, so what we recommend is that you have both an achievement question, and that you can word that however you want, but it needs to be something around people reflecting on their achievements or the areas in which they've succeeded over the recent past, and you need to tag that with an achievement tag. Now, by default, your systems will already have one of those in, so it would only be if you removed some of the default questions that won't be present. Within our new question setting screen, and there's a separate webinar on that as well, we do warn you if you don't have that set within the system, and recommend that you set one if you want a 10Pulse score. The second question you will need is a recognition question, and that's a specific type of question within the system. So an achievement and a recognition question are required to get an accurate 10Pulse score within the platform itself.
Great, thanks, Andy. Question here from Steph. Does 10Pulse work out the box for all users, or do we need a certain sort of license?
Yeah, it's a great question. So 10Pulse works out of the box for everyone with Connect Squared or with the Momentum packages. Connect does not include the 10Pulse capability. It will only start working after 10 weeks of data. So you need to wait 10 weeks for it to start providing you with accurate data within the tool. Once it's got that 10 weeks worth of data, you'll be getting weekly updates to that metric.
Cheers, Andy. And last question, unless any more come in, from Leon. If we need help improving scores, how do we get it?
Yeah, so yeah, I can take that again. So first of all, and following this call, we'll send over a link through to our support pages, which have a number of practical ways in which you use 10Pulse, but also some recommendations as well as the deck that we talked about today. So you'll have that to hand. But secondly, just reach out to your designated customer success partner. Remember, they are HR professionals, and they are able to provide some guidance. So if you want to discuss with them your current 10Pulse scores and some interventions and maybe some activities that will help that, reach out to your CSP and they will be able to help you out. In certain cases as well, Chris and the people science team can also assist with some of those recommended interventions as well. So first of all, reach out to your customer success partner, and it may be that also one of the people science team will be of use as well to that activity.
Great, cheers, Andy. And just to add, guys, we've actually got a best practice guide for 10Pulse, which goes into a lot more detail over topics we talked about today, including some interventions. So I'll ask that gets included in the email that gets sent out to you after this event as well. And that's a really useful resource for understanding more. And that's the end of our session today, guys. So thank you very much for turning up. Just one quick favour that we'd like to ask is that we're on G2, which is a review website for software, and if you are willing to spend 10 minutes, we would be really grateful. If you love Weekly10, if you could jump on g2.com and leave us a review, that would be fantastic. That's the only payment you need to make today, and only if you've got time. But that's everything from us today, guys. So thank you once again for your time. Andy, thank you to you for your time, and we'll see you all soon. Cheers, guys.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, guys.